Midnight ritual gone wrong. Summoning demons under a lunar eclipse. Occult horror. Chapter 1. The Forbidden Tome. It was a rainy afternoon when Jamie, Alex, Sophia, and Mark found themselves wandering through the dusty, dimly lit aisles of the university's library. The place had an eerie quality to it, a forgotten relic from an earlier time. Its towering shelves were packed with books no one had touched in decades, perhaps longer. The rain tapped gently on the large arched windows, filling the silence with a rhythmic pulse, as though urging the four to keep searching for something, though none of them knew quite what that something was. Jamie, the quietest of the group, was trailing behind, skimming through random titles when Alex called out from a far corner. "Hey, check this out!" His voice echoed through the library, breaking the serene stillness. The other three moved toward him, curiosity piqued. Alex stood beside an old shelf near the back, his hand resting on a thick, leather-bound book that looked utterly out of place amidst the dry academic texts. It was ancient, its cover cracked and peeling, bound with brittle leather that had darkened with age. Strange markings ran down the spine, symbols none of them could recognize. "I bet no one's opened this thing in 100 years, Alex mused, his usual cocky smile on full display. Jamie frowned as she drew closer. Something about the book gave her an odd feeling, like they were intruding on something they weren't meant to see. Sophia, always the most enthusiastic of the group, reached out before Jamie could voice her concern. "Let me see that," Sophia said, her voice full of excitement as she took the book from Alex's hands. The leather was cold to the touch, and a shiver ran down her spine, though she quickly shook it off. She opened it, revealing pages yellowed with time, filled with dense, handwritten script. At the edges of the pages were elaborate drawings, some beautiful, others grotesque. Strange creatures, human-like yet distorted, stared back at them from the illustrations. Mark, leaning in to get a closer look, raised an eyebrow. "What is this? Some kind of old religious text?" he asked, half joking, but his tone carried a note of discomfort. Sophia scanned the pages, her fingers tracing the edges of the text. "It looks like rituals, summoning something." Her voice dropped as she read a few lines aloud. Here it says, "Under the midnight sky, the gateway shall open, and the shadow of the forgotten will rise." Alex chuckled, but his eyes glinted with something deeper, curiosity perhaps, or the thrill of discovering something forbidden. Summoning? Like a demon or something? That's ridiculous. But wouldn't it be wild to try? Sophia closed the book and looked up at him with a smile. "You don't really think we should, do you?" Mark, always the skeptic, scoffed. "It's obviously just some old superstition. Probably a prank book made to freak people out back in the day. No way this is real." Jamie, however, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She was always the cautious one, and the strange symbols, combined with the illustrations, stirred a deep-seated unease. "I don't know, guys. It feels wrong. Like we're messing with something we shouldn't." But Alex was undeterred. He was always the leader, always the one pushing them beyond their comfort zones. His bravado masked the deeper insecurities he never let show. "Come on, Jamie. It's just a laugh. Imagine telling people we tried summoning a demon. The whole campus would lose it." Sophia's eyes lit up, always eager for a thrill. "We should totally do it. It'll be fun. Plus, nothing's gonna happen, right? It's all just make-believe." The decision was made, though Jamie remained silent, her unease growing by the second. The others had already convinced themselves this was just a harmless game, a way to inject excitement into their otherwise monotonous lives. After all, they were college students, young, invincible, and craving adventure. As they flipped through more pages, they found the exact details of the ritual. Each instruction was specific, yet cryptic. The rite must be performed at the stroke of midnight, under the canopy of stars, in a place where the shadows hold sway. Sophia read aloud, her voice soft, as though the very words demanded reverence. Alex, ever the daredevil, smiled. "I know the perfect place." They had a plan now. Meet at the abandoned courtyard behind the old physics building. It was isolated, overgrown with ivy, and always cast in deep shadow. The kind of place that felt frozen in time, perfect for their little midnight experiment. They agreed to gather there later that night, just before the witching hour. As the group prepared to leave the library, Jamie lingered a moment. her eyes drawn back to the book as Alex tucked it under his arm. A flicker of movement in the corner of her eye made her freeze. She turned her head sharply toward one of the towering bookshelves, heart pounding. But there was nothing there. Just rows and rows of old books, their spines brittle and cracked with age. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. Outside, the rain had intensified, pelting the windows and soaking the streets in darkness. The distant rumble of thunder added to the growing tension, though the others were oblivious. As they walked across the campus, talking excitedly about the upcoming night, Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, following them. She told herself it was nothing, just nerves. It was all just a bit of fun, after all. What harm could come from it? Later that night, as Jamie sat in her dorm room, staring out into the stormy sky, her thoughts returned to the strange book. She remembered the drawings, the eerie creatures that seemed almost alive on the page, their twisted faces etched into her mind. A part of her wanted to back out, to tell the others this was a bad idea. But she knew Alex wouldn't listen. Neither would Sophia or Mark. They never took anything seriously. With a deep breath, she pulled on her jacket and headed out into the rain. Chapter 2: The Midnight Invocation. The night was heavy with anticipation as the 4 students crept toward the secluded courtyard behind the old physics building. The campus, usually bustling with life during the day, was now a shadowy expanse of darkened paths and whispering trees. The storm from earlier had subsided, but the air remained thick with moisture, clinging to their skin as they moved silently through the overgrown ivy that choked the forgotten walkway. The courtyard had once been a place of study, perhaps even reflection, but it had long since been abandoned, left to decay as nature slowly reclaimed it. The moon, shrouded in thick clouds, cast only a faint, ghostly glow over the cracked stone and broken benches. Moss clung to every surface, and weeds grew unchecked between the cobblestones, as if they too sought to cover up whatever secrets the place might hold. Alex was the first to arrive, the forbidden tome tucked under his arm, a gleam of excitement still in his eyes. He scanned the area with satisfaction. It was perfect. Isolated, eerie, and just the right setting for what was to come. He had told himself repeatedly that this was nothing more than a prank, a spooky little adventure to pass the time. But as he stood in the middle of the courtyard, the night pressing in on all sides, a flicker of uncertainty flashed across his mind. He quickly pushed it aside, refusing to let fear take hold. Jamie, Sophia, and Mark arrived shortly after, their hushed voices breaking the silence that hung over the courtyard like a heavy fog. Jamie's unease was palpable, her eyes darting around as if expecting something to leap from the shadows at any moment. Sophia, ever the thrill-seeker, was practically vibrating with excitement, while Mark maintained his usual air of skepticism, though even he seemed unnerved by the desolation of the place. "You really think this is a good idea?" Jamie whispered, her breath fogging in the cool night air. She glanced at the book in Alex's hands, the strange symbols on the cover almost glowing in the faint light. Alex smirked, though his bravado seemed thinner now. "Relax, it's just a bit of fun. Nothing's going to happen." He opened the book to the marked page, the paper crackling under his fingers like dried leaves. Sophia and Mark gathered close, the flickering light from their phones casting long, wavering shadows against the moss-covered walls. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the courtyard itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. "Let's just get this over with," Mark muttered, folding his arms across his chest. They gathered in a loose circle, and Alex began to read aloud from the book, his voice wavering slightly as the ancient words tumbled from his lips. The language was foreign, guttural, and harsh, each syllable grating against their ears like the scraping of metal. The wind, which had been still moments before, suddenly picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees and swirling the mist that clung to the ground. The temperature dropped noticeably, a biting chill settling over them like a shroud. "Do you feel that?" Sophia asked, rubbing her arms as goosebumps rose along her skin. Jamie said nothing, her eyes wide, fixed on the shadows that seemed to grow longer, darker, with each word Alex spoke. The air felt different now, heavier, as though it was pressing down on them, suffocating. A faint humming noise, just at the edge of hearing, filled the courtyard, almost like the distant sound of whispers. Alex continued reading, though his voice now held a tremor he couldn't quite disguise. The wind grew stronger, howling through the broken windows of the nearby buildings, causing debris to skitter across the ground. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches swaying violently, yet the sky remained eerily calm, the storm long gone. As the final words of the passage left Alex's lips, a sharp crack echoed through the courtyard. The ground beneath them trembled, as though the earth itself had taken a breath. The shadows around them seemed to ripple, moving of their own accord, twisting and writhing like living things. Jamie let out a gasp, stepping back instinctively, her heart pounding in her chest. Did you guys see that? She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Mark, who had been standing closest to one of the old statues lining the courtyard, looked down in disbelief. The shadow cast by the statue had shifted, extending toward him like a long, dark hand reaching out from the abyss. What the hell? He muttered, backing away quickly. Sophia laughed nervously, though her eyes darted around with growing concern. Okay, that was weird, but it's probably just a coincidence, right? Maybe the wind, or something? But deep down, they all knew it wasn't the wind. Something had changed. The courtyard, once merely forgotten and decayed, now felt wrong. The air was thick with a presence they couldn't explain, a creeping sensation that made their skin crawl and their breaths shallow. Guys, I think we should leave, Jamie said urgently, her voice rising with panic. She looked around, desperate for an exit, but every path seemed darker, more foreboding than before. Alex, though shaken, wasn't ready to admit defeat. Come on, it's just our minds playing tricks. We've all seen too many horror movies. This is exactly the kind of stuff that happens when you expect to be scared. But as he spoke, a low, almost imperceptible growl emanated from the shadows. It was deep, resonating through the air, as though it was coming from all directions at once. They froze, eyes wide, hearts racing. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until it felt as though the very walls of the courtyard were vibrating with its intensity. What is that? Sophia whispered, her voice trembling as the shadows seemed to pulse, drawing closer. A cold gust of wind swept through the courtyard, extinguishing the light from their phones. Darkness swallowed them whole, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing and the distant growl, now impossibly close. Run, Jamie whispered, her voice barely audible, but it was too late. The ground beneath them trembled once more, and the shadows surged, enveloping them in an inky blackness that seemed to swallow the very air. Something had been summoned. Chapter 3, the first to fall. The days following the ritual brought an unsettling change to the group. What had started as a casual experiment had left an unshakable tension hanging in the air. Alex, once brimming with confidence, was the first to show signs that something had gone terribly wrong. He had always been the leader, bold, daring, and unwilling to admit defeat. But now, something about him seemed fractured, like the foundation of his sanity was crumbling beneath him, slowly but surely. Jamie noticed it first. At first glance, it was subtle. Alex's sharp wit dulled, his usual bravado turned into a strange sort of detachment. He had begun isolating himself, speaking in half-sentences or falling into long silences, staring into space as if something unseen gnawed at his thoughts. His eyes, once bright with energy, now seemed haunted, shadowed by an invisible weight he refused to acknowledge. It was during one of their group meetings at the campus cafe when his behavior took a darker turn. Alex sat in silence, pushing his cup of coffee back and forth across the table. Jamie, Sophia, and Mark exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere between them had shifted, the carefree dynamic that once defined their friendship now replaced by a thick, palpable dread. They hadn't spoken much about the ritual, each pretending nothing had changed, but they all knew better. "Hey, Alex?" Jamie ventured, breaking the awkward silence. "You okay? You seem off lately." Alex glanced up, blinking as though he'd forgotten where he was. His face was gaunt, dark circles beneath his eyes betraying countless sleepless nights. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just haven't been sleeping well." "Nightmares?" Sophia asked, leaning forward slightly, concern etching her features. "We've all been having them. You too, right?" Alex's grip on his cup tightened, the sound of his fingers scraping against the ceramic unnerving. "I don't want to talk about it." he said flatly, eyes darting nervously to the window, as if expecting to see something lurking outside. Jamie sighed, frustration bubbling beneath her worry. Alex, we need to be honest here. What we did, she hesitated, lowering her voice. It wasn't normal. We all felt something that night. Mark shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. Maybe we're just psyching ourselves out. People do crazy stuff when they're scared. Alex shot him a look that sent a chill down Jamie's spine. You don't know what you're talking about, Alex whispered, his voice low and distant. They're watching us. Every time I close my eyes, they're there. In the corners of my room, in the shadows. He paused, his voice trembling. And they're whispering, always whispering. A heavy silence fell over the table. None of them knew what to say. Sophia broke it first, attempting to lighten the mood with a nervous laugh. You sure you're not just overthinking this? We've all had weird dreams, but shadows whispering? Come on, Alex. But Alex didn't laugh. His eyes darkened as he glared at her, his voice almost a growl. You don't hear them, do you? You don't see them. They're real, Sophia. They're real, and they're getting closer. Jamie's heart sank. It wasn't just fear in Alex's voice, it was something far worse. Paranoia. Desperation. His words weren't those of someone who had simply lost sleep. He was spiraling, sinking into some unseen abyss that none of them could reach. Over the next few days, Alex's behavior only grew more erratic. He stopped attending classes, locking himself in his dorm room. The others tried reaching out, but he refused to let anyone in, claiming he needed to be alone. But it wasn't just isolation. Alex was losing himself. The once carefree, charismatic student was now a shadow of his former self, his mind consumed by fear. Jamie went to his dorm one evening, desperate to talk to him, to snap him out of whatever dark hole he had fallen into. She knocked on his door, the hallway eerily quiet in the evening gloom. No response. She knocked again, more insistent. Alex? It's me, Jamie. Please, let's talk. There was a sound from inside, a soft, scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. Jamie's stomach tightened with unease. Alex? She called out again, pressing her ear against the door. Suddenly, the door creaked open just a sliver, and through the crack, she saw his room in disarray. Papers and books were scattered across the floor, the bed unmade, and strange symbols, ones she didn't recognize, were scribbled across the walls in a frenzied, chaotic script. The air in the room was heavy, stifling, as if it hadn't been aired out in days. Alex stood in the far corner, his back to her, muttering to himself. His voice was low, a steady stream of unintelligible words. Jamie's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped inside cautiously, trying to ignore the growing knot of fear in her gut. Alex? She whispered, her voice trembling. What's going on? You need to talk to me. He didn't turn around. Instead, his muttering grew louder, more frantic. Jamie took another step forward, her pulse quickening. As she reached out a hand toward him, he suddenly stopped speaking and froze. Don't touch me, he screamed, whirling around, his face contorted with terror. His eyes were wild, darting around the room as if he was seeing things that weren't there. They're here, Jamie. They're in the room. They're everywhere. Jamie recoiled, her heart racing. Alex, please calm down. We can figure this out. But he was beyond reasoning. His breathing grew ragged, his eyes wide with panic. It's too late, he whispered, backing away from her. It's too late for me. They've already claimed me. I can hear them. They won't stop. They're coming for all of us. Before Jamie could say another word, Alex bolted for the door, shoving past her with a force that sent her stumbling into the wall. She watched, frozen, as he disappeared down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. That was the last time any of them saw him. The next morning, his dorm room was found in complete chaos. Alex was gone, vanished without a trace. His belongings were left behind, but there was no sign of him. No messages, no calls, just nothing. It was as if he had been swallowed by the very shadows he had feared so much. Sophia and Mark were frantic, searching the campus and calling his phone, but it always went straight to voicemail. Jamie, on the other hand, knew deep down that something far worse had happened. Alex hadn't just run away. He had been taken, claimed by whatever they had summoned that night. And now, she realized with growing dread, it wasn't over. They were all still in danger. Whatever they had brought into this world was still lurking, still watching, and it wasn't finished with them yet. Jamie was the first to accept the horrifying truth. One by one, it would come for them all. Chapter 4, Into the Abyss. Alex's disappearance left an inescapable void in the group, one that couldn't be filled by silence or denial. The days that followed were thick with tension, the weight of his absence hanging over them like a shroud. Jamie, Sophia, and Mark found themselves moving through the university halls like ghosts, each haunted by their own growing fear. They had all seen the chaos in Alex's room, the scribbled symbols, the signs of his frantic terror. They couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was out there. Something had come for him, and it wasn't finished. Sophia, once rational and composed, now teetered on the edge of hysteria. She couldn't stop talking about the ritual, the cursed book, the night they summoned, whatever it was. Her fear had taken on a life of its own, spiraling into a desperate need for answers. She paced around her dorm room, her fingers tracing frantic circles on the pages of the book as she tried to decipher the symbols they had foolishly ignored before. "We have to reverse it," Sophia muttered, her voice shaking. "There has to be a way to undo what we've done." Mark, who had spent the last few days insisting that they were all overreacting, sat at the edge of the bed, arms crossed, brows furrowed. He hadn't quite shaken his skepticism, but the strange occurrences had begun to wear him down too. "Reverse it? You're talking like we're in some horror movie. Maybe Alex just had a breakdown." "A breakdown?" Sophia's voice rose, incredulous. "You saw the room, Mark. You saw the symbols. And you know damn well this isn't just about Alex losing his mind. Something is happening to us, and it's only getting worse." Jamie stood by the window, staring out into the night. The campus beyond was shrouded in darkness, the dim lights casting long shadows across the courtyard. She hadn't said much since Alex vanished, but her silence spoke volumes. She felt it too, the looming presence, the unseen force that had begun to stalk their every step. Mark shook his head. "I don't see what panicking is going to accomplish. We can't even be sure it was the ritual. We're just freaking ourselves out." "You still don't get it, do you?" Sophia interrupted, her eyes wild with frustration. "This isn't a game, Mark. It never was. We opened a door, and now something's come through. It took Alex, and we're next." As if on cue, a sudden, low creak echoed through the room. The door, which had been firmly shut, began to inch open on its own, moving with agonizing slowness. All three froze, eyes wide, watching in silent terror as the door swung wider, revealing the empty, shadow-filled hallway beyond. Jamie's heart pounded in her chest. It had been like this for days now. Doors opening, lights flickering, strange sounds in the dead of night. At first, she had tried to rationalize it, but now she couldn't. There was something in the shadows, something that was waiting, watching, and drawing closer with each passing day. Sophia's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's here." Mark finally stood, his confidence wavering. "It's just the wind," he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He moved to close the door, but before he could reach it, the lights in the room flickered, plunging them into darkness. A deafening silence followed, broken only by the rapid pounding of their hearts. Jamie squinted, trying to adjust to the sudden blackness, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel it now, more than ever, the presence, thick and suffocating, lurking just out of sight. "Sophia?" Jamie whispered, her voice barely audible. But there was no answer. Panic surged through her as she reached out blindly in the dark. "Sophia?" she called again, louder this time. Her fingers brushed against something cold and solid, Mark's arm, but Sophia was nowhere to be found. A low, guttural sound came from somewhere in the room, a sound that wasn't human. Jamie's blood ran cold as she turned toward it, her body trembling with fear. She saw a flicker of movement, just a glimpse, as if the shadows themselves were writhing, alive with some malevolent force. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Sophia. But it wasn't the Sophia she knew. Her friend stood frozen at the far end of the room, her body rigid, eyes wide with terror. Her mouth moved, forming silent words, but no sound came out. And then, before Jamie could comprehend what was happening, something unseen, wrapped itself around Sophia, dragging her backward into the dark. It happened so fast, so silently, that Jamie barely had time to scream. One moment, Sophia was there, her terrified eyes locked on Jamie's, and the next, she was gone, swallowed whole by the abyss. "Jamie!" Mark's voice snapped her back to reality, but it was too late. Sophia had vanished, just like Alex, leaving nothing behind but an empty space where she once stood. Jamie's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Mark knelt beside her, his face pale with shock, his bravado shattered. "What the hell just happened?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Tears streamed down Jamie's face, her mind racing. "It took her," she choked out. "It's taking all of us." For a moment, they sat there in the suffocating darkness, neither knowing what to do, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. The reality of their situation was finally sinking in. This was no coincidence, no hallucination. They had summoned something, and it was hunting them down, one by one. "We need to get out of here," Mark muttered, his voice shaky but determined. "We can't stay in this place." Jamie shook her head, still reeling from what she had just witnessed. "There's nowhere to run," she whispered, her voice hollow. "It's everywhere. We can't escape it." Mark didn't respond. The hopelessness in her words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. He stood up, helping Jamie to her feet, and they both moved toward the door, the shadows seeming to press in around them. As they stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered back to life, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The campus was eerily quiet, the usual hum of student life replaced by an unsettling stillness. Jamie and Mark hurried down the corridor, both too terrified to speak. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to move, had to stay ahead of whatever it was that had claimed Alex and Sophia. As they reached the main building, Jamie glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see something following them. But the hallway was empty. For now. Mark's breathing was labored, his earlier skepticism now entirely replaced by fear. "We need to find someone," he gasped. "A professor? Who's going to believe us?" Jamie snapped, her frustration bubbling over. "Do you even believe us?" Mark didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said it all. They were alone in this. No one would believe their story. About the ancient book, the ritual, the demon. And even if someone did believe them, what could they do? Jamie's mind raced as they made their way across the darkened campus. Sophia was gone. Alex was gone. And now it was just the two of them, left to face whatever was coming. Chapter 5. The Demon's Lair. The campus felt colder now, as though the life had been sucked from its very walls, leaving only the hollow echo of Jamie and Mark's footsteps. They were the last two. Alex had disappeared into madness. Sophia had been dragged into the darkness, and now it was just them, barely clinging to the fragile hope that they could stop whatever nightmare they had unleashed. Jamie's fingers trembled as she flipped through the brittle pages of the tome. The strange, ancient symbols seemed to pulse beneath her touch, alive with a malevolent energy that made her skin crawl. The cryptic language felt impenetrable, its meaning lost to time, but Jamie knew there had to be something, some clue, some hidden message that could help them reverse the curse before it was too late. Mark paced behind her, his hands clenched into fists. His once calm demeanor had all but crumbled, and now he looked as frightened as she felt. They were trapped in a race against time, with no way of knowing how long they had left before the darkness came for them too. Anything. Mark's voice was barely above a whisper, his desperation clear. "I don't know," Jamie muttered, squinting at the faded text. "It's like pieces are missing. The pages don't make sense." She felt the weight of Mark's gaze on her as he stopped pacing, his breathing shallow and uneven. They had spent hours scouring the forbidden book, but it was as if the answer they were searching for had been deliberately obscured, hidden in the fragments of a language neither of them could fully understand. "This is pointless," Mark muttered, running a hand through his hair. "We don't even know what we're looking for." Jamie bit her lip, trying to hold back the rising tide of panic. He wasn't wrong. The more they searched, the more it felt like they were grasping at straws, chasing shadows. But what other choice did they have? They couldn't just wait for the demon to take them. "There has to be something," she insisted, her voice shaking. "We didn't perform the ritual properly. Maybe that's why this is happening. If we can find out what we did wrong, we might be able to fix it." Mark scoffed, though the fear in his eyes betrayed his bravado. "Fix it? We can't even read half of this thing, Jamie. How are we supposed to fix anything?" "I don't know," Jamie snapped, slamming the book shut in frustration. Her heart pounded in her chest, a suffocating sense of dread creeping into her mind. She could feel it, the demon's presence, lurking just beyond the edges of reality, watching them, waiting. Mark sighed, rubbing his eyes. "We're screwed, are we?" Jamie didn't answer. She couldn't. Deep down, she knew he was right. The demon was getting stronger, its influence seeping into their thoughts, twisting their perceptions. Already, the shadows seemed to move on their own, and whispers echoed in the silence, taunting them with promises of doom. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. Jamie froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Mark?" "I'm right here," Mark whispered, but his voice sounded distant, as if the shadows were pulling him away. She strained to see him in the dark, her heart pounding with fear. The air around them felt heavy, oppressive, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressing down on her. She could hear it again, the low, guttural sound of something moving in the shadows, something that didn't belong in their world. "Mark?" she called again, louder this time, her voice shaking. But there was no response. Her stomach twisted with dread as she groped through the darkness, her fingers outstretched, desperate to find him. But all she found was emptiness, cold, suffocating emptiness. A sudden gust of wind slammed into her, sending her stumbling backward. She could hear the sound of furniture scraping across the floor, books falling from their shelves, and a low, ominous growl that made her blood run cold. "Jamie?" Mark's voice was a scream, filled with terror, and in that moment she knew it was happening again. She turned just in time to see the darkness swell around him, a shapeless, writhing mass of shadows that coiled around his body like tendrils, pulling him toward the abyss. His eyes were wide with terror, his hands clawing at the air as he tried to fight it off, but it was useless. The demon had him now. "Help me," Mark cried, his voice breaking with fear. "Jamie, please." She rushed forward, her heart racing, but it was too late. The shadows swallowed him whole, dragging him into the void before her very eyes. One moment, he was there, his desperate eyes locked on hers, and the next, he was gone. Gone, just like Alex and Sophia. Jamie collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. Tears streamed down her face as the reality of her situation hit her like a freight train. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. The darkness seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with its weight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled her mind, drowning out her thoughts. She could feel it now, the demon's influence, creeping into her consciousness, poisoning her reality. Was this real? Was any of this real? She could no longer tell where the line between reality and nightmare ended. The world around her twisted and distorted, shadows dancing at the edge of her vision. She heard the voices again, Alex's frantic whispers, Sophia's desperate screams, Mark's final plea for help. They echoed in her mind, taunting her, driving her to the brink of madness. And then, through the chaos, a single thought pierced through the fog. The ritual. She had been right. The ritual had been incomplete. That was why the demon had been able to cross into their world. That was why it was hunting them. There was still a way to stop it, but only if she could figure out how. With trembling hands, Jamie picked up the forbidden tome once more, her eyes scanning the pages frantically. The symbols seemed to blur and shift before her eyes, but she forced herself to focus, to push through the fear and confusion. There had to be something she had missed, something that could save her. And then, she saw it. A small, faint symbol in the corner of the page, almost invisible against the aged parchment. It was different from the others, sharper, more precise. And next to it, scrawled in the margins, were the words she had been searching for. The final step. Jamie's heart pounded in her chest as she traced the symbol with her finger, her mind racing. It was so simple, so obvious, yet they had missed it in their haste to perform the ritual. If only they had followed the instructions properly, none of this would have happened. But now it was up to her. She was the only one left, the only one who could put an end to this nightmare. The demon's presence loomed over her, its whispers growing louder, more insistent, but Jamie refused to give in. She had come too far to be consumed by fear now. With a deep breath, she rose to her feet, the tome clutched tightly in her hands. It wasn't over yet. There was still hope. Chapter 6. The Final Summoning. The wind howled through the cracked windows of the abandoned building, carrying with it the chill of something far darker than the night. Jamie stood in the center of the room, her hands trembling as she held the ancient tome close to her chest. The air around her felt thick, oppressive, as if the very fabric of reality was bending under the weight of the darkness that lingered just beyond the veil of her vision. The shadows had grown restless, their shapes swirling and twisting like living creatures. She could feel it now, more than ever, the presence of the demon, lurking in the unseen corners of the room, watching her, waiting. She had no choice. The ritual had to be completed, no matter the cost. Jamie's fingers traced the faded symbols on the pages, her mind racing. She had spent hours trying to decipher the final step, the missing piece that would undo the horrors they had unleashed. The forbidden language of the tome was difficult to comprehend, but somehow, through sheer determination and fear, she had found a way. She knew what had to be done now, but as she prepared to begin, a low, guttural voice echoed from the shadows, making her blood run cold. "Did you think it was that simple?" Jamie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was deep, ancient, dripping with malice. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the walls and floor, filling the room with an eerie sense of dread. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness, but she couldn't see anything, just the shifting shadows, the flickering lights, and the creeping sense of being watched. The demon was near, closer than it had ever been. "You think you can stop me now?" The voice grew louder, more mocking. "Foolish girl, you never summoned me. I have always been here, waiting. You only opened the door." Jamie's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. The demon hadn't come because of the ritual. They had simply unlocked something that had already been lying in wait, lurking in the darkness all along. The ritual was a trap, a carefully laid plan to draw them in, to make them believe they had power over it when, in truth, it had been manipulating them from the start. "I was always here," the demon hissed, its voice dripping with satisfaction. "You were just foolish enough to let me in." Jamie's grip on the tome tightened. She could feel the weight of the demon's words settling in her chest like a stone, threatening to crush her under the enormity of her mistake. But she couldn't back down now. She had come too far. Slowly, she stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. "I don't care what you are or how long you've been here. I'm going to end this." A deep, rumbling laugh filled the room, shaking the very walls. "End this? You can't even begin to comprehend what you're dealing with." Jamie's heart raced, but she held her ground. The ritual had to be completed, even if it was part of the demon's plan. There was still a way to stop it, a way to seal it away for good, but the cost was something she hadn't fully prepared for. The final words of the ritual echoed in her mind, chilling her to the core. To close the door, to banish the demon once and for all, a sacrifice was required. A life had to be given, not as a mere offering, but as a permanent seal to bind the demon to the abyss from which it came. Jamie swallowed hard. She knew what had to be done. As she began the incantation, the shadows around her grew more violent, swirling faster and faster as if trying to smother her before she could finish. The room darkened, the flickering lights finally extinguished, leaving her in complete darkness, save for the faint glow of the symbols in the book. The demon was trying to stop her, but she pressed on, her voice growing stronger with each word. Suddenly, the air around her seemed to thicken, and a dark figure emerged from the shadows, its shape grotesque and otherworldly. The demon was here, fully manifesting in the physical world. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with an eerie light, and its twisted form moved with an unnatural grace, like smoke given life. "You can't win," the demon growled, its voice now a deafening roar. "Even if you complete the ritual, you will only seal your own fate." Jamie hesitated for a fraction of a second, the weight of the demon's words hanging heavy in her mind. But then she remembered Alex, Sophia, and Mark. They were gone because of this creature, and if she didn't stop it, more would follow. She couldn't let that happen. With renewed determination, she spoke the final words of the ritual. The demon howled, its form writhing in agony as the ancient words took hold, binding it to the place between worlds. The air around Jamie crackled with energy as the ritual reached its peak, the barrier between the physical realm and the abyss beginning to close. But then, in that moment, the truth became painfully clear. The ritual was working, but it required more than just words. It needed a soul to anchor it. And that soul had to be hers. The demon's laughter echoed through the room once more, though its form was fading, pulled back into the abyss. "You've won, girl, but at what cost?" Tears welled in Jamie's eyes as she felt the pull of the abyss growing stronger, tugging at her very essence. She had known this might happen, but now, faced with the reality of her sacrifice, the weight of it was almost too much to bear. For a brief moment, she considered stopping, abandoning the ritual and fleeing. But deep down, she knew there was no escape. If she didn't complete the ritual, the demon would remain, and more lives would be lost. With a deep, shuddering breath, Jamie made her decision. "I won't let you hurt anyone else," she whispered, her voice filled with both fear and resolve. And with that, she spoke the final word of the incantation. The room exploded with light as the ritual completed, the demon's form vanishing into the void, its screams of rage and pain fading into the distance. The air grew still, the oppressive weight of the demon's presence lifting at last. But as the light faded, Jamie felt herself being pulled into the darkness. The abyss yawned before her, vast and endless, its depths calling to her like a siren song. She had succeeded. The demon was sealed, but so was she. The last thing Jamie saw before the darkness consumed her was the faint glow of the tome's pages, now lying abandoned on the floor, the final step completed. Her sacrifice had saved them all. As the shadows closed in, a single thought lingered in her mind. Was it truly over? In the silence that followed, the room was empty. But somewhere, deep within the abyss, a whisper echoed, a faint, malevolent sound, hinting that the demon's story might not be finished after all. Jamie was gone. But the door was still there, waiting.